Did you know that Matthew and Luke wrote their Gospels to fix the disasters that Mark had done by writing his own Gospel? Well, this guy called C.J. Cornwaith will explain why he thinks that that is so. So let's listen to him and see if he has a point.
In this video, I want to talk about 5 embarrassing things that Mark includes in his gospel that the other gospel writers fixed. And to do this, I'm going to do one of my favorite things, which is to show you some text, show you the gospels side by side, and show you where I can how the other gospel writers fixed these embarrassing details that Mark stuck them with. Before we start, I should say my name is Chris. I have a Master of Divinity, Master of Arts in Theology, and a PhD in Christian Origins. And I do this channel to talk mostly about early Christianity with a little bit about modern Christianity thrown in. So if you haven't done so yet, please take a second and subscribe. So before I start, there's one thing I need to explain. That is the synoptic problem. I'm not going to talk too much about it in this video, but we know, looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that they have a literary relationship to each other. Mark was written first, probably between 65 and mid 70s. And both Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source and copied. And I've shown in this video here, if you want to go a little bit deeper on this, I actually show examples of how you can see that they literally just took the Greek from Luke and copied extensively.
No, this is your interpretation. This is your hypothesis. This is not a given. The fact that Mark was written first is not a given within the biblical scholarship community. There's all sorts of hypotheses out there. People that say that Mark was first, people say that Matthew was first, people say that Luke was first. You have all the people say that Q was first. There's all type of hypotheses there because the synoptic problem is probably the one big problem in biblical studies that will probably never be solved because it's too complex. You're going to be able to find examples where it seems like Matthew and Luke copy from Mark, and you're going to find examples where it seems that actually is Mark and Matthew maybe looking copying from Luke, and vice versa. Okay, that's why you have all the spectrum of possible hypotheses out there among the scholars because it's not clear. So saying from the get-go that we know that Mark was the first to write the gospel, we're off to a bad start. This is not a given. This has not been established. That can be your own hypothesis, which is great. And to be honest, it's my own hypothesis. I believe that Mark was written first, but I'm not going to sell that as if we know. No, we don't, and probably nobody will ever know about this. So just to set things clear here from the get-go.
Again, I've said this so many times, but I'll say it one more time just to make sure nobody hears this. This is not multiple eyewitnesses to the same events. The Gospels were not eyewitnesses. We don't have any indication that they were eyewitnesses. We have
Again, this is your hypothesis, your opinion, which I respect. There's a lot of things in the gospels that actually point exactly on the other position, which is the gospels are the eyewitness testimony of those who lived with Jesus or those who lived close to those that knew Jesus. So again, this it's not a given, it's not a truth, it's your opinion, which I respect. But again, it's not that we know that.
every indication that they are creating stories based on other written accounts. And I did a video on that as well here on the Gospels not being eyewitnesses. So both Matthew and Luke copied Mark as a source.
Okay, again, your opinion.
And when they copied Mark, one of the things they did is fix Mark because Mark is a really interesting, unique, weird gospel. And a lot of the problems that I think Mark created, I mean, I love Mark. I find it so interesting. And it's not a problem for me, but I think for later gospel writers and even for modern Christians, there are some problems that Mark creates.
Okay, so there are two big assumptions here. One, Mark was the first to write. Second, Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. Three, Matthew and Luke found embarrassing things in Mark that they needed absolutely to fix and or hide. Huge assumptions here. All right.
That needed an explanation. And in this video, I'm going to show you 5 problems that Mark creates that other gospel writers tried to fix. Okay, so we're going to get started here. I've laid the text out like this. I like to do this. This text is taken from the NRSV translation of the Bible, which is my favorite, and in my opinion, probably the best. I've also taken a bit of Greek text that I'll talk about, but I'm not going to do too much with Greek today. This is mostly, you can mostly do this in English. So let's go through these 5 weird stories. And we start in Mark chapter 3. I think Mark is one of the most interesting gospels, and you get the most interesting portrayal of Jesus. And here is one thing that you could see didn't sit too well with later gospel writers. So let's read just these verses. Mark chapter 3, verse 20 says, Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, He is out of his mind. So we have a little skip. So the Pharisees do this whole thing about saying Jesus is casting out demons by Beelzebul, the prince of demons. And then Jesus says this thing about a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand. So that's really good. So there's a little interlude here in Mark. And then we come to Mark 3, verse 30, and it says, Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. Who are my mother and my brothers? He asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. So, yeah, Jesus' mother doesn't know who he is. Interesting.
Where does Mark says that? Where does Mark say that the mother of Jesus doesn't know who he is? Where does he say that? I don't know. I missed that. I missed that. Mark simply says your mother and brothers are outside looking for you. Where does he say that Mary does not know who Jesus is? Okay.
His family said he's out of his mind. Now, I need to address one really quick apologist's argument here. So, one thing you'll get from apologists, and this is why I included the Greek for this one. So, the Greek here, in talking about right here, we translated Jesus' family, right here, his family heard about this. So, the Greek there, I've highlighted in green, is hoi parotu. And hoi parotu actually literally just means like those who were around him, like
Yes, exactly.
it's a way of expressing people who are close to him, like those from around him. But it's a way of expressing like familiarity. It could be translated family. And one of the things you'll hear apologists say is like this isn't actually his family that doesn't get it. It's actually his disciple. Don't.
It depends on the context, right? It could be family, it could be disciples. It simply says those close to him. Basically, that's what the Greek says, those close to him, around him, close to him. Depending on the context, this may mean many things. I agree. Um, Seems like you are the one jumping to the conclusion that those were his mother. Um, Among those, there was his mother, right? So let's see.
Don't get it as a common way of reading this, or maybe somebody else. But yeah, you have this thing hoi paro too, and this the NRSV has translated this. His family heard about this, and I think that's the right decision. I actually really think there's no way around. I really think it's hard to make the argument that this isn't talking about Jesus' family.
And it may very well talk about Jesus' family because we know from another gospel, John, that Jesus' so called brothers did not believe in him. So this may very well refer to Jesus' brothers that do not believe in him and he thought he was out of his mind. That's perfectly fine. Where does here where does Mark here say that this includes Mary? He doesn't say. This could very well be referring to his brothers that didn't believe in Jesus. So again, on top of the 3 assumptions that I listed in the beginning, here there's another huge assumption that this expression, those close to him, included his mother. Again, not granted.
Because you really have this thing about in Mark chapter 3, verse 21, Jesus' family goes out to take charge of him. So, like, they leave. And then in verse 31, after this Beelzebul thing, they arrive. And
Yes, sure, they arrive. Okay, first of all, there's a big jump there. I can even agree that that verse 21 continues in verse 31 after that interlude. That's fine. But again, why do you jump to the conclusion that that general expression, those close to him, included everybody, including Jesus' mother? Okay, it just does not stand. There's other examples there. It could be simply that Jesus' so-called brothers didn't believe in him. They thought he was out of his mind, and they wanted to go and bring him back. But since they were not blood brothers of Jesus, they didn't have any authority on him. And so they brought his mother together with them to convince him to come back. Like, there's so many other explanations before jumping to the conclusion that Mary did not know who Jesus was. It, right? Again, it's not granted. These are just ungranted. It's just jumping to conclusion based on presuppositions.
They're standing outside and they sent someone in to call him. Why are they standing outside? Because a crowd gathered. So he and his disciples were not even able to eat. So you have this scene that flows really cohesively in Mark, just really logically. Jesus is here, crowd is gathered, family comes to take charge of him, and then his family gets there and he says this thing about who are my mother and brothers. So Matthew and Luke both include this thing about his mother and brothers standing outside. So they include this story when they copy Mark, but they very conspicuously leave out this thing about his family thinking he's out of his mind. Now, there are a lot of reasons why we might leave this out if you're editing this. First of all, Matthew and Luke have already given us extensive nativity stories that include Jesus' mother, getting a call from an angel, getting all this background information on who Jesus is, what his calling is. So, why the heck would his family think he's crazy? Like,
Because the brothers did not believe he was the Messiah. So this could very well be a reference to just the brothers. Again, you're just jumping to the assumption that Mary is included in that. And there's nothing here that pushes you or, you know, to conclude that that is the case. Again, you can think, you can extrapolate from the text that it, sure, that's a possibility, but the text does not say that. So again, it's not conclusive, it's not convincing. Okay. um I'm not sure, right? What to do with this. Again, we know that John is is not embarrassed to say that his brothers did not believe him in him. And guess what? John does not have the nativity either. So is John embarrassed by that? Is not embarrassed by that? Why does he leave out the nativity but still says that his brothers did not believe in him? Like, again, it does not follow.
why wouldn't they actually know that this is part of what Jesus is called to do by God? And I think it's pretty clear that Mark doesn't have any indication, he doesn't have any concept of a nativity story. I've
Why? Why? Again, another conclusion that is not, it just does not follow. It does not have any idea of the nativity story simply because it does not talk about it. How can you conclude that from just this sentence? Again, this could very well just refer generally to the brothers, and that's perfectly coherent with all the other gospels, including John. Again, you're jumping to conclusions that are not granted by the text.
seen another video right here that Mark actually talks about the Spirit coming into Jesus at his baptism, and I'll talk about that again actually in a minute. Um, so this is Jesus' family not understanding him, which is completely contradictory with what you get in Matthew and Luke.
No, I already explained that, so I'm not going to spend more time here.
And Matthew and Luke obviously know this, and they leave this off because it contradicts the story they want to tell, in which Jesus' family is around from the beginning and they are part of the action right from the get go.
No, no. It's only Mary that is part of that, not his family, as John um, specifies. So,
Presumably, Jesus' family noticed when they went to Egypt in Matthew, or in Luke when they're in the temple and Jesus gets this blessing from the temple. about being the Messiah. So it's kind of embarrassing. So I think Matthew and Luke did the thing that was the easiest, and they just left it off. And if you want a little
That's not the only explanation you can find. This is conspiracy theory explanation, which is fine. You can have that, but again, if you cannot prove it, it's just speculations.
bit more evidence about how they just left this off, look at one more thing here. Here, Jesus is speaking to the crowds. Here, his mother and brothers came to him, but they could not reach him because of the crowd. So if you read here in Mark, we actually start with the crowd. A crowd gathered, that's why they can't get to him. So they took out these details, but they kept the crowd. Because of the crowd, that's why his mother and brothers are outside. So I think it's pretty clear. This is what's happening. His family heard about it. They came to take charge of him.
Sorry, I missed this last point. What's the contradiction here? What's the contradiction here about the crowd? I mean, Mark says there was a crowd, nobody could get there because there was a crowd. Matthew and Luke say that Jesus was speaking to the crowd, and his mother and his brother could not get to him because of the crowd. Where's the contradiction here? I didn't get this.
He's out of his mind. Super embarrassing detail, but not to worry if you're Matthew or Luke because you just fix it. Embarrassing thing number one, Jesus' family, apparently in Mark, has no idea who Jesus is or what he's called to do.
Yeah, that's true. His brothers, not his mother. Very simple explanation against the conspiracy theory explanation that you're putting forward.
Moving on to the second thing, this is just a really quick one, but I think it's interesting. Mark 10:18 says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." If you remember the story, a rich man here comes to talk to Jesus and calls him good teacher. And Mark has, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." Interestingly, Luke actually keeps this identically, and even if you don't read Greek, you could see, just look at the shapes of the letters here. It's literally identical, highlighted in Greek. So you literally have the exact same thing. Oh wait, there is one I forgot. There's one word different. So this monos is different, but it also just means alone essentially. So Luke has copied this almost verbatim. There you go, almost verbatim. But Matthew obviously
Why copy it? Right? It's possible, but again, it's just your assumption that Luke is copying Mark here. It's not copying. There's a difference there in a word. So maybe it's Mark copying Luke. What about that?
saw that maybe somebody could have some trouble with this. I'm not sure really why. I'm not sure if it's because this implies that Jesus wasn't God, but I think you could just argue. I could make the argument like, well, Jesus is sort of asking a rhetorical question here, like about why do you call me good? But in any case, Matthew decided to change this. So he actually said, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good," and maybe here the implication obviously is God too. So it's just a slight change of the wording. I don't know if it changes the implications.
No, it doesn't. So one translation could be, why do you ask me about what is good? But actually, another translation could be, why do you ask me about who is good? Tu agathu, the good one. Why do you ask me about the good one? There's only one who is good, God. So really, absolutely, there's no contradiction. There's no changing of meaning. Absolutely nothing. And here, it's, I mean, I don't know what he's going to say now, but if the point is this was too embarrassing that Matthew and Luke needed to fix this, why did Matthew fix it but Luke didn't? Apparently, Luke was not embarrassed by this, but Matthew was. Hmm.
all that much. But I think potentially, I think what you can see is Matthew maybe saw this as a problem for his readers and smoothed it out a little bit just to avoid any potential confusion.
Okay, so it was possibly embarrassing for Matthew. Luke didn't have a problem with that, but okay, let's throw it in there, just to get to increase the number of examples. All right, let's move on to the next one.
Okay, this one, number three, really interesting. This is one of my favorites, I think, because it actually talks about how Jesus' power is limited in Mark. So I'm going to read a bit of backstory. This is in Mark 6. It says, "He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And a little bit more about his family. And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." A famous saying, "Prophet is not without honor except in his own country." And this usually, the way I heard it, it was always his, is the way we used to say it when I was a kid. And here in Mark 6, we get the crux of this. Mark 6:5 says, "And he could do no deed of power there, except he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them." We have here a limit of Jesus' power. And I've heard it argued that, oh, it's because of their faith. He could, like, people will try to weasel out of this and say, like, this isn't actually limiting Jesus. This is just because they didn't have enough faith that he couldn't do it. But I think if you actually look at the Greek, and I do want to point to the Greek here because I think it's important, this uk idunato literally means he was not able to, like he did not have the ability to. So there would be another way to say that he didn't do it. I'm trying to think of how you would say he could not, if you meant like not that he didn't have the ability, but he chose, you could say like he chose not to do anything there. Like there are different ways to say that, but
No. Um, he couldn't do it is a good way of explaining that. It's not about, this is a theological problem. It's not that he didn't choose to do it, it's that he couldn't, but not in the sense that he was not able to do it. In the sense that God performs miracles only on those who are willing to accept that. He's not going to force miracles on people. That's what Mark is saying, right? He couldn't do it simply because they didn't want to accept it, not because he didn't have the ability of doing it. Do you really think that Mark believes that Jesus didn't have that day didn't have the power of doing it? What do you think Mark was thinking? That Jesus that day was like feeling weaker? That it was not a good day for him to perform miracles? That he didn't wake up, in the right mood? Like, what do you think Mark is implying here? In fact, if you keep reading, Mark says that Jesus said that he was astounded or astonished about the lack of belief. So Mark is giving basically the solution to the apparently embarrassing situation, which is about the belief of the people. Jesus couldn't do it because simply they didn't want to accept it, not because he didn't have the power of doing that, or he didn't have enough energy to do and perform a miracle that day, right? I mean, again, just this. I mean, you decide which one makes more sense. I don't know. I mean,
Mark actually here pretty clearly says that he could not do any like dynamic deed there. He couldn't do any deed of power, is the way that this translation has it, which is kind of a weird way of translating Udemy and Dunamin, but it's tricky to translate. So he was not able to do there. The ake is there a deed of power. And then if you look at Matthew, the Greek here, actually, let's look at the English because I think that's just fine. The English says, "And he did not do many deeds of power there because of their unbelief." So you get two things that Matthew fixes here to smooth this out a little bit. First of all, it's not that he couldn't do it. Matthew just takes this verb, poiesai, which means he was not able to do, and Matthew just says he did not do. So it doesn't say it wasn't because of Jesus' limitation.
but Mark doesn't say that it was about Jesus' limitation. That's again, it's another stuff. You're reading that into the text. If you read the text with an open mind, it's pretty clear that Mark is not talking about a limitation of Jesus. And put this in context with the Gospel of Mark, where Mark shows that Jesus performs all these kind of miracles. Do you really think that Mark believes that Jesus had some limitations? I don't know. Again, this is not, frankly speaking, an honest way to approach the text. You're trying to read way too much in this when the it's absolutely clear what Mark is trying to say, and Matthew expresses it in a slightly different way. but you're saying the same thing. So again, this sounds to me conspiracy theory.
It was because he just didn't do them. And you even have a reason that he gives because of their unbelief. So, this is a really interesting edit by Matthew for something that's potentially problematic. Why does Jesus have limited power? Well, Matthew says here he just didn't do anything because
Matthew didn't think that Jesus had limited power. Mark didn't think that Jesus had limited power. They're just both pointing to the fact that the lack of unbelief is an impediment for the miracle. Again, God does not force miracles on top of people that don't want that miracle to happen. That's the only thing they're saying.
of their unbelief, not he couldn't do anything. This one is also cool. What are we at now? 4, I think? Yeah, 4. Making Jesus less angry at the disciples. So Mark 10:14, we have this nice story about children coming to Jesus and the disciples forbid them. And Mark 10:14 says, "But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant, and he said to them, 'Let the children come to me. Do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom belongs.'" And here we have the word, I grabbed it down here, aganacteo. It's tricky to say, aganacteo. So the verb here is to be indignant, to be angry, to be vexed. And he says, Jesus was indignant. Jesus was angry. Jesus was furious, might be another way to say this. So Jesus basically loses it on the disciples and then says this thing about let the little children come to me. And when we go over here at Matthew 19, we get something a little bit sweeter. Jesus just says, let the little children come to me. So Matthew takes out the part where Jesus loses his shizit and adjusts it to just say, let the little children come to me. So this is an interesting one because you ask, why would Matthew, like, I don't know that there's necessarily anything wrong with Jesus being indignant or
Exactly. So what's the point?
angry about this. But Mark certainly throughout, Mark has this theme of like the disciples just being stupid. Like the disciples almost never get what Jesus is trying to do. They start to clue in a little more near the end. But it's a theme in Mark, and I think Matthew is just trying to present maybe either the disciples as less dumb or maybe Jesus as less angry or both. But Matthew just makes it a little bit sweeter.
But what's your point? So the point is that they cannot possibly use different words to say the same thing. And if somebody puts a little bit more color and the other take out the little color, then it must be that they were embarrassed by what the others say. I mean, this is what you would expect from people that tell the same story from three different points of view, right? Somebody adds a little bit more color here, somebody adds a little bit more color there. But why do you want to read into this all this conspiracy that Matthew and Luke were embarrassed about this when you yourself admit that there's nothing embarrassing about Jesus being angry? We see Jesus angry all the time and indignant all the time against the Pharisees, against the publicans, against the scribes, against the money changers. He starts throwing all the tables and stuff like that. Why would Matthew and Luke be embarrassed by that? Again, you're just reading into the text of this conspiracy that you're trying to build here. There's nothing in this.
And if we look over here, this is one that actually Luke does the same thing with. And it's interesting that Matthew and Luke use different words for this. They both smooth this out in their own way, kind of.
No, they just use different words because they're telling the story from their point of view. Right? So when they use the same words, you accuse them of copying that, of copying. They're copying, they're copying, they're copying. They're not eyewitness. When they change, oh, they're still copying, but fixing because they were embarrassed. You see that it's all based on this presupposition, right? You basically always win, right? When they use the same word, it's because they're copying. When they use different words, it's because they're still copying but fixing. Okay, you can never win with this type of arguments.
Keeping this nice saying of Jesus from Mark, but framing it very differently. So Luke here, Luke just basically calls to them and say. So it's very similar but slightly different framing. So both Luke and Matthew here, I think, for probably similar reasons, fix the awkwardness of Jesus getting angry in Mark. Coming down a little bit further, you've already probably seen this heading. Did I say we were at five? How many are we at now? One. I think I may have started off with the wrong number here. Jesus' family doesn't get it. One. Why do you call me good? Two. Limits of Jesus' power. Three. Making Jesus less angry at the disciples. That was four. Jesus messes up a healing. I actually have six of these. I'm sorry. So I'm on number five now. I can't count. If I do listicles, I can't always count very well. I think this one's really interesting. So this is the healing that doesn't really take, and it's so bad that I think both Matthew and Luke omit it. But I'll kind of show you how we can tell this. So the story is they came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." So Matthew and Luke just omit this. And this, I mean, somebody skeptical could say, like, "Oh, how do you know they admit it? Maybe they just, maybe they're just telling different stories. Maybe like somebody who is bothered by the synoptic problem
No, they would not use that voice. Come on.
could try to explain away why Matthew and Luke omit this story. But what's interesting, you don't get this in Luke, but in Matthew, you actually see an identical structure to this chapter, Matthew 15 and 16. So you literally have the stories in the same order. You have the feeding of the 4,000, feeding of the 4,000 at Mark 8, 1 to 10. Pharisees seek a sign, Pharisees seek a sign, Mark 8, 11 to 13. Discussion about the leaven, Matthew 16, 5 to 12. Same discussion, Mark 8, 14 to 21. Then it omits the blind man. And then after you have Peter's confession at Matthew 16, and down here at Mark 8, 27, you have Peter's confession. So Matthew knew this story. This is not like this was something that Matthew didn't know about. Matthew chose to omit this because he kept the identical structure of everything else here, but kept this out.
Okay, let me give you another option. Mark wrote after Matthew and added that part. Again, you see how this conclusion that you can get to, it's based on the presupposition that Matthew's copying from Mark, which is not granted. We talked about it at the beginning. Again, it could be your interpretation, could be even my interpretation, right? Or my hypothesis, my opinion. Do we know for sure that Matthew is copying from Mark and it's not the vice versa that Mark is adding to Matthew? No, we don't. So again, these are conclusions based on presuppositions. But okay, let's assume that Matthew for some reason just saw Mark, wanted to copy everything, didn't like the story, threw it away. Okay, let's go with that assumption.
And you can see why it's kind of embarrassing, because it's Jesus, this all-powerful healer, Son of God, maybe. We have to talk about the theology, but anyway, I won't do that in this video. We have Jesus as this powerful healer, and he can't actually do the healing.
He can't do the healing? He can't do the healing? What do you mean he can't do the healing? Didn't Jesus heal the blind man? Okay, I read verse 25 and said his sight was restored and he saw everything clearly. What do you mean he did not heal the blind man? He just did it in 2 steps. I know, and I know where you want to get to, but don't say that Jesus could not perform the healing. He did perform the healing. He did not fail. All right.
Now, I also think it's probably something really interesting happening in Mark here. So on the one hand, you have a healing that doesn't take, but
yes, it does take. It happens. What do you mean it does not take? It just takes 2 steps, which is, I admit, something unique that never happens anywhere else in other gospels or even within the Gospel of Mark. But it's not that the healing does not happen, just he fails. No, the healing does happen.
I don't think Mark included this for no reason. Like, I think it would be easy for Mark to say, just to say something about, like, just to say it worked. Like, we wouldn't know the difference if he just said that if he just said that Jesus healed the man.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we believe that this actually happened, and it happened exactly like that, because it's so, in a sense, unique and in a way weird that Jesus performed this miracle in 2 steps. that there's no reason why Mark would have invented something like this. So I agree. And this is probably what actually happened. Okay, good. We agree.
So why does he include this? I'm not sure. I find it really interesting.
Okay. So the only reason why he introduced this here is because it happened, right? There's no other reason why he would come out with this two-step miracle other than that's what happened, right? Again, there's no need to search for conspiracy theories here. You know, the obvious solution is, well, that's what happened, and Mark wrote it.
It's a really interesting question. I have to ask myself if it's something the blind man is seeing. Often in Mark's sickness or illness is actually because of demonic possession. So it's really interesting to ask what this man is apparently seeing when he sees people like trees. Is he having some kind of vision of another realm? Is this something heavenly? I honestly don't know. And I'm not going to say that that's what's happening because I actually don't know.
And probably nobody knows exactly. There are interpretations of why Jesus did it that way. There could be very profound theological implications for that, but we're not going to enter that into here. The point I want to make is that your assumption is, oh, since he did it in two steps, it must mean that the first time he failed. There's so many other explanations that go against this conspiracy theory mindset, which is Jesus wanted to prove a point. Jesus wanted to convey some kind of theological, message or meaning that needs to be pondered and meditated upon. There's so many other explanations than, oh, Jesus failed the first time and then he fixed it. Okay, this is again conspiracy theory mindset, not granted, especially when you see into the context of the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus performed all these kinds of crazy miracles. Okay,
But it's interesting to think about. And at the very least, we could just imagine this as a two-part miracle that didn't take, that created a problematic way of looking at Jesus.
I really think that he believes that eventually he did not heal the man. I don't know. Sounds like he feels he reads into this that Jesus didn't really heal the man. He healed the man just in two steps.
That later people wouldn't have liked. But I did grab this cool story because even though this doesn't appear in the other Gospels, there's a similar story in Suetonius in the.
Okay, I'm gonna skip this part because he's gonna start talking about something kind of superficially, a story that is found in Suetonius about the life of the Emperor Vespasian, of some kind of healing of a blind man spitting on his eyes. To be honest, I don't know what's the point here. I don't know what this has anything to do with the synoptic gospel, with Matthew and Luke supposedly embarrassed by this passage. I don't know what he's trying to say. He's trying to imply that Mark invented it or copied it from Suetonius. I don't know. To be honest, this is completely derails from the point he's making. So I'm gonna skip this. We're gonna jump to the last one.
This is the final thing, and I did a full video on this again right here. So you can go and check it out if you want, but I'll just include it because as I was making this list, I think this is one of the most interesting things because you have right at the beginning of Mark chapter 1, this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. You have John the Baptizer appearing in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of the repentance of the forgiveness of sins. And then, of course, you have this thing. Oh, I'm sorry, this spreads over pages, but you have Jesus coming to be baptized by John in the Jordan. And what happens when Matthew and Luke get a hold of this story, they both try to explain why it's not a big deal that John would baptize Jesus. Jesus being baptized for the repentance of the forgiveness of sins. Why would the sinless Jesus need that? And here in Matthew, there's a really good explanation. Matthew has this nice little dialogue between John and Jesus where John says, I need to be baptized by you, but you come to me. But Jesus answered him, let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Matthew loves things that fulfill righteousness or the law. So yeah, this gives Matthew a nice little answer for why Jesus needs to be baptized by John. But then if you come to Luke, you have this setup with John the Baptist. I baptize you with water, but the one who's more powerful than I is coming. So this whole story by John the Baptist. But then what's weird about Luke is that Herod actually shuts up John in prison. And then in the next thing, now when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, the heaven was open. So Luke actually just omits this fact that Jesus is baptized by John. He put
Luke omits the fact that Jesus had been baptized by John the Baptist. Didn't you just read it? Verse 21. Now, when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized by whom? Obviously was baptized by John the Baptist. Now, your point is, well, but in the verse before, Luke says that John had been in prison. But of course, this is like an obvious flash forward on on the end of John. What happened to John at the end? He was arrested and shut up in prison by John, and then Luke does not want to continue the story of John with the death of John and so on. So he comes back and picks up the story again, saying, "Well, all the people have been baptized, and also Jesus had been baptized. Obviously, he had been baptized by John the Baptist." Like, if anybody reads the Gospel of Luke, even without Mark and Matthew, immediately understand that what Luke is talking about is the fact that Jesus had been baptized, obviously before John the Baptist had been put in prison. Otherwise, who would baptize him? Like, there was nobody else baptizing. That's why he was called John the Baptizer, because he was the one baptizing. So, okay, like, Luke doesn't say explicitly that Jesus was baptized by John, but really, do we really need to jump to the conclusion that Luke somehow is trying to hide the fact that John the Baptist uh, baptized Jesus? Why does he say then Jesus had been baptized? Why does he just omits that if it's so embarrassing? Now, again, there's two ways of addressing the text, right? One is starting with these lenses that that I call conspiracy theory lenses, that say, well, Luke is trying to manipulate something here. Is trying to throw smoke so that people may not realize that Jesus had been baptized by John the Baptist. And by the way, Luke, as Mark says, that John was baptizing for the remission of sins. So it's not just Mark that talks about that. Luke is not embarrassed by that, and is not embarrassed by the fact that Jesus had been baptized also. Okay, so again, this embarrassment that sometimes kicks in, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, were they embarrassed? Were they not embarrassed? If Luke was embarrassed, why doesn't he just omits this part? Because everybody that reads this and puts two and two together gets to the obvious conclusion that Jesus had been baptized by John before John was put into prison, right? I mean, like, what other conclusion would people imagine that after that, after the moment that John the Baptist was arrested, like somebody else took his place, and like an unknown person started baptizing people randomly with no authority? Like, what would you expect people to understand when they read this? Obviously they understand that Jesus was among those people that had been baptized, and the tense there tells that he had been baptized before John was arrested. Like, that's the obvious conclusion that everybody that reads Luke would get to. So if Luke is trying to hide something, sneakily throwing smoke, well, that's a very bad attempt, because everybody that reads Luke is going to end up to the same conclusion that Jesus was baptized. So what is he even trying to hide?
puts John in prison, and then just kind of in passing mentions that Jesus was baptized. Doesn't say by who. Doesn't say by who. But the focus here is on.
But who else could baptize? There was only one guy baptizing. Like, you see how this becomes a little ridiculous, right? It's
The heavens open. And in John, as I've said elsewhere in that video again, which you can watch, I did a full breakdown of this passage if you want. But John basically just doesn't even mention that Jesus was baptized and focuses exclusively on the dove coming down from heaven.
But John is a completely different story that has nothing to do with the argument that he's trying to prove right now. So this is all he had. So supposedly these five examples show that Matthew and Luke were somehow embarrassed by what by what Mark wrote. I don't think he proved it. There were just, to me, conspiracy hypotheses with really no substance at all, especially because there's simply a much simpler, more honest explanation for those little differences in how Matthew and Mark and Luke address the same episodes that Mark talks about. So if you like this content, like, subscribe, and God bless you.